Tonight we drift into the quiet shadows of New York with the undercover agent you may know as Donnie Brasco. Find a comfortable position, let the day fall away, and follow this calm crime story right to the edge of the mob world. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you now. Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let us step gently into the story together. Chapter 1. The Teacher from Paterson. Joseph Pistone liked mornings quiet. In Paterson, New Jersey, the day usually tried to argue with him about that. Trucks grumbled past the little house. Someone 2 doors down argued with a radio that was a little too loud. The city had a way of clearing its throat before the sun even climbed over the roofs. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug that tasted like coffee and duty in equal measure. The linoleum under his elbows was worn where he liked to lean. On the chair opposite there was an empty place that belonged to evenings with his wife and children, not to early hours like there. Mornings were his time to think, before the phones and the files and the small frictions of the day started tugging at him. He had grown up around noise. Erie first, then Paterson. Neighborhoods where everybody knew who you were related to, and where certain corner bars belonged more to quiet men in sharp suits than to the block itself. As a boy, he had noticed things adults thought he did not see. Hands heavy with rings, cars that did not match the houses they parked in front of, laughter that never quite reached certain eyes. That early curiosity had turned into a habit. Watch, remember, connect. At Eastside High School, a teacher told him that was called observation, and that he was good at it. Later, at Paterson State College, he learned to call it anthropology, and write neat papers about how people behaved. Underneath the academic terms, though, it was still the same simple practice. Sit quietly, listen, let people tell you who they are. For a while, he tried to sell that skill the honest way. He stood in front of classrooms with chalk dust on his sleeves, teaching children who did not always care about the difference between one continent and another. He had liked the work more than he admitted. There was something satisfying in watching a kid suddenly understand a map or a story, but there was also a restlessness in him that the blackboard did not calm. That restlessness found a new home when he joined Naval Intelligence. The work felt like a sharper version of what he already knew how to do. Pay attention, read patterns, understand people who would rather stay unread. By the time he took the oath for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he had already decided he preferred the kind of job where the stakes were more serious than schoolyard arguments. He began his bureau life far from the streets he had known as a boy. Jacksonville, Florida was humid and wide, a place of long roads and busy ports. His early assignments were a plain kind of honest, paperwork, interviews, cases that made the news only in small print. He worked hard, but he felt like a spare part in a machine that did not yet know what to do with him. Then came the truck work. Someone noticed that he could drive almost anything with wheels. Old summer jobs on construction sites, odd hours behind the wheel of big rigs, had left him comfortable with vehicles that made other agents nervous. Suddenly he found himself in the middle of a hijacking investigation, sliding into the cab of a stolen truck like it was just another long afternoon drive. The first time they asked him to go in undercover, it sounded almost casual. They needed someone to pass as a driver inside a ring that specialized in stolen loads, a man who could blend in and ask the right question while pretending not to. He said yes in the steady way he did most things. No drama, no grand speeches, just a nod and a quiet understand that the job was changing shape. The stolen vehicle case taught him something about himself that the classroom and the office had not. He realized that he could slip into another skin without losing his balance. The men he worked around were tough in the way street legends tend to be, but they were also human. They complained about the weather, worried about their kids, and bragged about football scores. If he listened without judging, they relaxed. If he kept his temper calm, they mistook it for confidence. In that mirror of their expectations, a new version of himself appeared. Not yet Donnie Brasco, but a shadow of someone who could carry that name. Back in Paterson, his family only knew that he was busier now, longer hours, sudden trips, late-night calls from offices and motel rooms. He kept his explanations vague and polite. The bureau does not really lend itself to bedtime stories for children. He would sometimes stand in the doorway of his kids' rooms, watching them sleep, feeling like he was already living two lives and had not quite mastered either one. Transfers have a way of arriving in plain envelopes. The assignment that moved him closer to New York came like that. One day he was part of a case in Florida. Soon after, he was heading for the city he knew from both childhood visits and newspaper headlines. The unit he joined there handled trucks and hijacks, the arteries of illegal money that ran through the region. The city had changed since his younger days, but the rhythm of certain blocks felt familiar. The same narrow sidewalks, the same older men leaning in doorways, the same sense that conversations stopped and started depending on who walked by. On some nights when his official work was finished, he would drive without turning on the radio and let memories mix with the present. Rumors in the office sometimes moved faster than case files. People talked about organized crime families, about bosses and underbosses, about the strange mixture of old-world tradition and modern business that kept those groups alive. Joseph listened more than he spoke, filing away names and stories. His childhood around Italian social clubs, his time in Paterson, all of it had prepared him to understand this world in ways that others might not. One evening, a supervisor called him in for a conversation that did not feel routine. They spoke about his background, in the casual tone people use when they already know the answers and only want to hear how you phrase them. Where he grew up, the languages he heard at home, the kinds of people he had watched in those neighborhood bars. Then they talked about undercover work, not just the short kind he had done with trucks, but the deep kind, the kind where you disappear from your own life for months or years, where your real name becomes something that only a handful of people are allowed to say out loud. He listened. He asked calm questions. In the back of his mind, two pictures sat side by side. On one side, his family at the kitchen table, laughing about something unimportant, safe and ordinary. On the other side, a set of doors just beginning to open onto a darker corridor, lined with people in suits who thought they ran the city. The Bureau wanted someone to infiltrate the world of hijacking and stolen goods at a higher level. That meant getting close to the crime families that quietly arranged a lot of the business. Joseph understood what they were really asking. They were not offering a temporary costume. They were asking if he was willing to live as someone else for as long as it took. He did not answer right away. That night, back in Paterson, he sat again at his worn kitchen table. The same place where he drank his morning coffee now held the weight of a decision. His wife could tell something was on his mind, even though he kept his words careful and general. You do not tell the person you love that the government would like you to go make friends with men who unalive people for a living. You say that there is a long case coming, that it might mean travel and odd hours, that it matters. Later, after the house quieted, he stood by the window and looked out at the streetlights painting soft circles on the pavement. He thought about the kids at school he had once tried to keep away from trouble. He thought about the bar from his childhood where sharp-looking men had tossed small bills on the counter like they grew on trees. He thought about how many families had been pulled apart by decisions made in back rooms and car trunks. He realized that he had been circling this choice for most of his life without calling it by name. From the first time he had watched a card game through a half-open door, he had been half inside and half outside this world. Maybe, he decided, going all the way in with a badge in his pocket was his way of settling that. When he gave his answer to the Bureau, he kept it simple. Yes, he would do it. There were forms to sign, clearances to arrange, handlers to assign, quiet steps, each one carrying him further from the ordinary. His name would be removed from office rolls. If someone called asking for him, they would be told there was no one by that name. To everyone but a small circle, he would simply vanish. On paper, that disappearance meant safety and secrecy. In real life, it meant that the man at the Paterson kitchen table would slowly become a memory, even to people who thought they knew him. For now, though, he still had a few more peaceful mornings, a few more simple dinners, before the new identity took over. He held those moments carefully, like a man aware he was putting away a favorite book for a long time. He did not become sentimental about it. That was not his style. He simply noticed the way his children's laughter sounded in the hallway, the way his wife stirred sauce at the stove, the way sunlight fell on the chipped edge of the countertop. Soon, he knew, he would need to remember all of this from hotel rooms and rented apartments. Soon, the man called Joseph would step back, and someone named Donnie would walk forward. But for this last quiet stretch, he allowed himself to be only who he really was, in the city that had raised him and the home that held his heart. Chapter 2. Building Donnie. The first thing they changed was his name. Not legally, not in any courthouse way. On the official forms he was still Joseph Pistone, but in the files that mattered for the operation, the ones locked in cabinets behind code words, another identity began to grow. They called him Donald Brasco at first, and then, as his handlers and colleagues got used to saying it, the name softened into Donnie. It fit the part they were writing for him. Not a boss, not a big shot, but a small-time jewel thief who kept his head down and knew his business. They started with the basics of that life. Where had he grown up? Who did he know? Where did he learn about diamonds and watches? Every detail had to feel casual enough to pass in a smoky bar, yet solid enough to survive if someone decided to quietly check. He pulled from his real past in Paterson, reshaping old memories into new stories. His father had once run a bar that attracted half-serious gangsters and half-serious lawyers, cops, and neighborhood characters. As a boy, Joseph had wiped tables and watched how men like that moved and spoke. In the Donnie version of the story, those same kinds of people had taught him how to spot quality in a stone, how to tell a cheap watch from a good wine. All those afternoons of silent observation became part of the legend. The Bureau did not plan to leave it at street lessons. If Donnie was going to pass as a jewel thief, he needed to sound like one. That meant gemology courses, long hours studying the way light broke through different cuts. He sat in cramped rooms with charts and stones, learning terms that most thieves probably never bothered to say out loud, but that the few real experts would recognize. He learned how many facets a round, brilliant cut should have. He practiced telling small differences in color and clarity. He handled stones with the same care he brought to case files, knowing that someday a suspicious fence might drop a ring on the bar and ask his opinion. In that moment he would not have time to call an expert. He would have to be Ed. To him there was a certain dry humor in how serious everyone became about sparkle. Men planning to infiltrate one of the most dangerous crime families in New York were arguing over whether this stone looked more like near colorless or slightly tinted. He thought, not for the first time, that the world had a taste for irony. Alongside the technical lessons came the physical ones: clothes, posture, habits. Donnie needed to look like someone who had spent a lot of time on street corners and little time in offices. That did not mean loud outfits. In the world he aimed to enter, the truly dangerous men often dressed simpler than the kids who tried to imitate them. They settled on a wardrobe of worn leather jackets, shirts that were neat but not fancy, and shoes just good enough to suggest a man who made decent money without bragging about it. They discussed jewelry, then laughed quietly at the idea of a jewel thief showing off too much of his own merchandise. One modest ring, maybe a watch, nothing that screamed. He practiced walking differently, less straight-backed, more relaxed. He let his shoulders roll a little, his hands stay visible but loose. The key was to look comfortable in almost any room, as if he had already been there with someone else. On sidewalks and in lobbies, he rehearsed an easy slouch that said he knew his way around without needing to prove it. Speech was another layer. His natural speaking voice already carried traces of Paterson and the neighborhoods he had grown up in. Now he leaned into that rhythm, shaving away any hint of official crispness. He learned to slow his words down when talking business, to let silences sit between sentences, the way men do when they want others to fill in the blanks. One of his handlers pointed out that Donnie should not ask too many questions. Real thieves do not interview people. They let information drift in their direction and pretend not to care whether it arrives. Joseph knew this instinctively. but it helped to have it named. His strongest skill, listening, would now be disguised as laziness. The building of Donnie did not happen in a single training session. It took months of small adjustments. A new ID card here, printed with a name that did not belong to him. A shoebox under lock and key, holding the clothes that belonged to this other life. Occasional evenings where he took the identity out for a quiet spin in places where no one of consequence was watching. He would drift into a bar where strangers outnumbered regulars, sit on a stool, order a drink, and answer casually when someone asked his name. "Donnie," he would say, and let the sound settle in the air. He learned how it felt to hear someone call him that across a room. At first the name pulled at him, like a shirt that did not quite fit. Over time it began to rest more naturally on his shoulders. He noticed that when he was in Donnie mode, his mind organized information differently. Joseph, the agent, catalogued people according to case relevance, charges, and evidence. Donnie, the jewel thief, sorted them into who might buy, who might betray, who might introduce him to someone more important. The Bureau had a plan for how he would drift toward the circles they wanted him in. The underworld had its own gravity. Fences and thieves moved through a network of bars, back rooms, and after-hours joints where cash changed hands with minimal conversation. Donnie would start on the edges of that universe, offering small things, asking for small favors. The first real test came night in a place where the floor was sticky and the music too loud for the hour. He stood by himself, leaning on the bar, watching men who were trying a little too hard to look relaxed. At some point the bartender, who had been told to expect a new face that might be useful, made polite talk. Donnie mentioned, in an offhand way, that he sometimes moved jewelry, not enough to brag about, just enough to pay for a few drinks. He did not launch into details. In fact, he almost changed the subject. That was the trick. Casual could not be faked with too much effort. Later, after the bar closed, the bartender mentioned a card game at an after-hours club. It was the kind of invitation that meant more than it seemed to. You did not get invited to games like that unless someone thought you belonged near the edges of something bigger. He showed up late, by design. Men who hurried to those games did not last long. He played a few hands, lost a little money, and did not complain. That marked him as someone who understood that the cards were only half the point. He watched the other faces more than his own hand. Names floated by, some of them familiar from office whispers. In the weeks that followed, Donnie became a minor fixture in certain circles. He was not the center of attention. That would have been fatal. Instead, he was the guy near the wall, the one people started to recognize and nod to. When there was talk of stolen goods, he listened. Every so often, he let slip that he might know someone who knew someone. All the while, reports filtered back to the small circle of supervisors who actually knew who he really was. They adjusted his course like unseen tugboats, nudging him toward the smooth channels where lower-level thieves rubbed shoulders with men linked to larger families. Between these excursions into the night, he still returned home at times, though less and less. The contrast between worlds grew sharper. One evening, he sat on the couch with his family, watching a simple television program that required no decoding, and realized that his body was relaxed but his mind was still calculating angles as if he were in a crowded bar. It was a subtle sign of how thoroughly the new identity was taking root. Donnie was no longer someone he played for a few hours. Donnie had become a lens through which he looked at every room, even those that held only people he loved. He made a quiet decision then, one that he did not phrase out loud. If he was going to keep this balance, he would need to protect small pockets of ordinary life. Coffee at the kitchen table. A walk around the block where he looked at trees instead of license plates. These small rituals would anchor Joseph even as Donnie did the dangerous walking. His handlers, for their part, were pleased. The reports from the field described contacts with people linked to serious crews. A name kept coming up, someone who might become important. A man by the name of Anthony Mirror, known on the street for his temper, suspicion, and connections to a powerful family. Reaching a figure like Mirror could not be rushed. The underworld had a slow echo. Word travelled ahead of a man like Donnie, carried by bartenders and small-time hustlers. Some of the talk was invented. None of it could be controlled. All he could do was keep playing his role with patience and consistency, trusting that eventually someone higher up would decide he was worth a closer look. On nights when progress felt slow, he reminded himself that this was what he had signed up for. The job was not fireworks and dramatic raids. It was long hours of pretending to care mainly about small profits, small grudges, small jokes. In that low light, the real work happened quietly. He would drive back to his rented rooms as streets emptied around him, review conversations aloud to fix them in his memory, and then force himself to sleep. The alarm would ring, and the pattern would begin again. Another bar, another game, another chance to let Donnie be seen and filed away in the mental ledgers of men whose respect came grudgingly. Somewhere along the way, without a single clear moment of change, he realized that he no longer had to think before answering when someone asked his name. Donnie came first on his tongue, as natural as breathing. Joseph still existed, but he had stepped into the back row of his own life. That quiet shift meant the preparation was nearly complete. The man they had built on paper now walked the streets of New York, bearing stories smooth enough to survive casual testing and a patience deep enough to survive long nights. Ahead lay the real test, the introduction to people who would not hesitate to unalive a man they suspected of tricking them. The next steps would bring him under the wing of figures whose signatures were written in fear across entire neighborhoods. For now, though, he allowed himself a small, private thought as he turned a key in yet another lock on yet another temporary apartment. The role was built. The name was settled. The streets were starting to respond. Donnie Brasco was ready to meet whoever came next. Chapter 3: Meeting the First Gatekeepers. New York liked to act as if it barely noticed the men who slipped in and out of its side doors. The city paid attention to stock tickers and headlines, but the quiet traffic of favors and stolen goods usually passed under its official gaze. That was the water Donnie Brasco swam in, and he had learned to move with the current instead of fighting it. He spent his evenings in places that did not show up in tourist guides. Narrow bars where the lights stayed low and the televisions in the corners were always tuned to a game no one truly watched. Clubs where the doors stayed locked until someone inside looked you over through a small window and decided you were worth the trouble of letting in. In those rooms, people tested each other without announcing it. A question that sounded casual was really a careful probe. A laugh that seemed harmless might hide a note of warning. Donnie knew this, and he played his part the same way a card player works a hand. Nothing too bold, nothing too timid, just enough movement to keep things interesting. He had made a small name for himself as a man who could move jewelry quietly, not tons of it, not the high-end pieces that ended up in newspapers, but enough to show that he knew his field. The talk that followed him was half rumor and half truth, which suited him just fine. In his world, reputation was like smoke. You could guide it a little, but you could not hold it. At the bar on one particular night, he sat on a stool near the far end, not too close to the door and not too near the bathrooms. A good spot to see the whole room without being the first anyone noticed. The bartender, who had gotten used to his quiet presence, slid him his usual drink without asking. Men drifted in and out. Some stayed only long enough to scan the crowd and leave. Others settled in to complain about the day. Donnie listened as they traded small stories about deals gone well or badly. If someone mentioned watches or stones, he raised his eyes a little, not all the way, just enough to show that he was listening. He did not have to work very hard to be interesting. The underworld had its own curiosity. Any new face that stayed still long enough became a subject of conversation. By now, enough bartenders and minor hustlers had mentioned Donnie to one another that his name had reached people he had not yet met. One of those people walked in that night. Anthony Mirror did not look like a man who wanted to attract attention, and yet the room sharpened when he arrived. He was not especially tall or flashy. What set him apart was a certain edge in his eyes, the look of someone who had seen enough to be bored by most things and suspicious of the rest. He spoke softly to the bartender, then glanced down the line of stools. The bartender made a small gesture, a tilt of the head in Donnie's direction. That was all it took. In this world, introductions often started with the simplest signals. Mira moved closer, taking the empty stool beside him. Donnie could feel the weight of that choice. In a bar like this, where you sat and beside whom could be as meaningful as a signed contract, Anthony asked his name in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Donnie gave it, calm and plain, no extra details. Mira then mentioned that he had heard the name around, attached to whispers about jewellery, about a guy who knew how to handle hot goods without making a mess. Donnie responded in kind. He did not deny the rumours, he did not brag either. He kept his voice light, almost lazy, as if the subject bored him a little. That was the first test, passed by not trying too hard. As they talked, Mira sprinkled the conversation with small baited hooks. Questions about where Donnie had fenced certain items, names of neighbourhoods where he claimed to have done business. Any hint of hesitation would have marked Donnie as someone making up stories. Joseph, behind the mask, recognised the pattern. He had seen similar methods used by interrogators, only dressed differently. Because he had done his homework, because he had spent months weaving his backstory from pieces of real streets and real people, the answers came smoothly. He referenced bars that truly existed, mentioned side streets he had actually walked, recalled small events that felt specific but were vague enough to avoid being trapped by details. Mira watched him with a mixture of interest and skepticism. A man in his position did not stay alive by trusting easily. At some point he dropped a name that belonged to a fence Donnie claimed to know. The way he did it made the intent clear. This was a test. Donnie described the fence in enough detail to show he had met him, then shrugged, as if the man were just another contact in a long list. After a while, Anthony shifted topics to more ordinary things. Sports, weather, the annoyances of traffic. It could have been any two men killing time in a bar. Underneath the small talk, though, something more significant was happening. Mira was deciding whether this quiet jewel thief could be useful. At the end of the night, Anthony mentioned a card game in another part of town. The invitation was couched as casual, but Donnie heard the weight behind it. Card games were where money moved, and where people with real connections watched how you behaved when you lost or won. Donnie accepted with a nod, as if he had no idea a door was opening. Inside, Joseph marked the moment carefully. Months of patient work had brought him here, to a simple sentence from a man who held keys to the Bonanno family. The card game took place in a building whose front belonged to another business entirely. The path inside involved a side stairway, a hallway that smelled faintly of old paint and colder winters, and a door that opened only after a narrow window slid aside and a pair of eyes looked him over. When he stepped into the room, he saw the usual layout: a table with cards and chips, a smaller table with drinks and snacks, chairs pushed back against the walls for observers. Smoke hung in the air like a thin curtain. The men around the table glanced up, then let their attention drift back to the game. No one announced him. His presence had already been explained before he walked in. Mira sat near one end of the table, close enough to control the flow of conversation but not in a position that screamed authority. He gestured toward a chair. Donnie took it, placing himself into the circle with a calmness that came from long practice. He played without trying to impress. He won a few hands, lost more, accepted both with the same mild expression. Men at that table had seen enough sore losers and suspicious winners to know that making drama over cards was a bad sign. Donnie showed that he understood the unwritten rule. The game was less about money and more about watching how people acted under small pressure. Between hands, the talk shifted towards small jobs: a truck with television sets, a warehouse where someone looked the other way for a fee. Mira occasionally directed a question at Donnie, like a man testing the temperature of water. Would he be willing to help move something? Could he introduce someone to a contact? Could he guarantee that nothing traced back to the wrong person? Each time, Donnie replied in a way that walked a careful line. Too eager would make him look desperate. Too cautious would mark him as useless. He presented himself as someone who liked steady work and disliked unnecessary noise. That image matched what the Bureau wanted: a minor operator who could drift upward organically. By the end of the night, some of the men nodded to him with a familiarity that had not been there at the beginning. Small jokes included him. When the last hand was dealt and chairs scraped back, Mira pulled him aside for a brief, private word. He told Donnie that he might have some things coming up where an extra pair of hands would be helpful. Nothing too serious, he claimed, some pieces here and there's. Donnie said that sounded fine, that he liked simple work with clear pay. They parted in the stairwell, with Mira offering a parting remark that sounded almost friendly, though the threat behind it was understood. In this line of business, loyalty was not just a word. It was the difference between being invited back upstairs and being uninvited from life entirely. As the weeks passed, Donnie found himself included in more of Mira's activities. Some days it meant riding along on errands that looked like nothing special. Other times it meant being present in conversations where the names of higher-ranking members floated in the air like echoes. He learned quickly that Mira could be generous one moment and dangerous the next. Stories circulated about his temper, about how he handled people who disappointed him. None of the stories ended with gentle forgiveness. Despite that, or perhaps because of it, Donnie treated Anthony with patient respect. He did not flatter him. Men like Mira heard too much flattery already. Instead, Donnie offered small, practical acts of competence. Show up on time, keep his word, pay what he owed, say little but remember everything. In the mirrored maze of mob relationships, that steady reliability made him stand out quietly. Mira, who was used to people either trying too hard to impress him or trying too hard to avoid him, began to lean on Donnie in small ways, asking him to drive, sending him to deliver messages, including him in meetings with other associates. Through Mira, Donnie was introduced to people whose names carried more weight, men whose connections reached deeper into the Bonanno family structure. The introductions were not formal, no one stood up and made speeches. It might be as simple as sitting in on a conversation in a booth at the back of a restaurant, or sharing a table at an all-night diner after a job. Each new face was a page in Joseph's mental notebook. He catalogued mannerisms, relationships, who deferred to whom. He noticed who kept quiet when certain subjects came up, who spoke with the authority of someone close to the center. After each long day and longer night, he slipped away to report the web of connections to his handlers. On the surface, nothing explosive had happened yet. There were no dramatic raids, no sudden revelations, but underneath, a slow shift was occurring. Donnie Brasco was no longer simply a jewel thief hovering at the margins. He was being drawn closer to the heart of a world the Bureau had long struggled to penetrate. The process was almost invisible from the outside. It looked like a man sitting at card tables, leaning on bar counters, standing beside cars while others talked. That was the nature of true undercover work. The big moments were built out of countless small ones that no one would ever see on a front page. Sometime during that season, as the city moved from cold winds to sticky heat and back again, Donnie noticed that the faces around him had become familiar. He knew who would be at which bar on which night. He knew which tables were reserved for which crews. He knew that when Mira reached a certain point in his drink, the conversation would shift into a narrower, more serious lane. In that narrowing lane, another name began to surface more often. Benjamin Ruggiero, a man known as Lefty. A man who, unlike Mira, might one day speak of Donnie less as a useful stranger and more as a sort of adopted son. The first gate had opened. Ahead waited another, guarded by a man with a tired voice, a sharp memory, and a heart more complicated than the outside world would ever know. Chapter 4, Lefty and the Rules. The first time Donnie saw Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero up close, he did not look like a man anyone would put on a movie poster. Lefty was older than most of the guys who did the loud bragging. His hair was thinning, his clothes carried the weary elegance of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to stay half a step above broke. What struck Donnie most was the way Lefty talked. He always seemed to have a story ready, as if silence made him uneasy. His remarks wandered from one topic to another, but underneath the rambling there was structure. He told lessons disguised as gossip, warnings wrapped in jokes. They met properly through Mira, though the path had taken its time. For a while, Donnie would see Lefty at the bar or at a card game, nodding politely, nothing more. Then midnight, Mirror waved them together with a gesture that suggested he wanted the two men to know each other better. Mirror introduced Donnie as the guy who moved jewellery, the quiet one who did not talk out of turn. Lefty looked Donnie up and down, not with suspicion exactly, but with the weary assessment of someone who had seen a lot of hopeful faces and buried many of them in his memory. He asked a few questions in his gruff, unhurried way, what Donnie did, who he knew, how he handled his money. Donnie responded with the now well-practiced mix of honesty and crafted detail. At some point Lefty grunted in a way that passed for approval, then began talking about himself without being asked. He spoke of years in the life, of favours done and favours never fully repaid. He listed names of people who had risen and fallen in the family, some now reduced to whispers and others promoted to positions where they let others do the risky work. He did not speak with bitterness exactly, but there was a rough edge of disappointment in his tone. Over the next weeks, Donnie found himself spending more time with Lefty, often at Mirror's direction but increasingly by Lefty's choice as well. If Mirror was a gatekeeper, Lefty was more like a guide, whether he intended to be or not. He had a habit of lecturing, and Donnie had a gift for listening. The match suited them. Lefty liked to ride in the passenger seat while Donnie drove. The city slid by outside the windows as he talked. He explained the rules of their world the way an old teacher might explain multiplication tables. Slowly, firmly, with repetition baked in, he told Donnie who deserved respect and why. There were the bosses, the captains, the soldiers. There were the associates, like Donnie, who were not made men but hovered near the edges of that inner circle. He described the ceremonies that Donnie was not yet part of, hinting at them more than naming them. The message was clear. There was an inside and an outside, and every step closer to the centre carried both privilege and risk. He talked about money almost as much as he talked about honour. In their world, the two were tightly bound. He explained how much of any score went up the chain. No one kept everything. Everyone wet someone else's beak, as he liked to say, his accent softening the words into something almost tired. To outsiders, these might have sounded like the complaints of a man who felt underappreciated. To Donnie, they were also an education in the economics of organised crime. The structure that law enforcement studied in charts and diagrams was alive in Lefty's constant muttering about who sent what to whom. Lefty also had his own code of personal loyalty, not always identical to the official. He could be harsh, but he could also be oddly generous with the people he considered his. Over time, Donnie realized that Lefty was beginning to include him in that group. The older man would refer to him as his guy, his kid, his protégé. This was not just a sentimental thing. In the organized world, claiming someone was a serious step. It meant responsibility. If Donnie messed up, it would reflect on Lefty's. If Donnie prospered, a piece of that success would be credited to Lefty's guidance. The connection was both personal and professional. For Joseph, behind the scenes, this closeness was both an advantage and a burden. On the bureau side, becoming Lefty's man meant gaining access to deeper layers of the family. On the human side, it meant sharing long car rides and late-night conversations with someone whose trust was real, even if it was built on a lie. He could not avoid liking Lefty, despite knowing the kind of life the man had lived. Lefty talked about his own family with a rough affection. Children who did not always understand why he lived as he did, a wife who had stayed through lean years and worse, small fights over money, over hours kept, over broken promises. The contradictions sat side by side. Here was a man who could discuss sending someone to be unalived in the same breath as he worried about a grandson. The world rarely offers clean lines, and for Joseph, sitting in the driver's seat, the blur was impossible to ignore. Lefty had countless rules, some official, some entirely his own. He corrected Donnie on everything, from how to address certain men, to how to sit at a table, to how often to call and check in. If Donnie went a day without calling, Lefty made sure he heard about it. You do not make a man like that feel ignored. That was one of the many unwritten lessons. Respect, in their world, was measured in attention and availability. Donnie learnt to call Lefty first thing in the afternoon and last thing at night, checking in like a son who knew his father needed to hear his voice. At restaurants, Lefty insisted on choosing the table. He picked spots where he could sit against a wall with a clear view of the door. He gave Donnie instructions on where to sit, who should have their back to which part of the room. It was both paranoia and protocol, and it had been drilled into him by decades in a dangerous trade. Donnie accepted these orders without complaint. He knew that every time he followed a rule, he engraved himself more deeply into Lefty's sense of him as a loyal guy. The more natural the routines became, the more invisible the undercover work felt, which was exactly what the Bureau needed. They spent hours in coffee shops that never closed, hunched over small tables, mugs cooling between them. Lefty would talk about past jobs, small wars between crews, the old days when certain bosses still walked certain neighborhoods. He spoke with a mixture of pride and frustration, feeling that he had given his life to the family and received only partial appreciation in return. He told Donnie that in this life you keep your mouth shut, your eyes open, and your ears sharper than both. You do not talk to police, you do not complain to outsiders, you handle business quietly. Then he would look at Donnie and say that he saw those traits in him: a calm head, a quiet style, someone who knew how to be around serious men without acting like a fan. Each time he said it, Joseph felt a dull ache of guilt. To keep the cover, he accepted the praise. To stay sane, he reminded himself why he was there. Every story Lefty told about someone being taken out for crossing a line was a reminder of the real cost of this life, paid by more people than the men at the top. As Donnie rose in Lefty's estimation, others noticed. The crew began to treat him less as a newcomer and more as an established piece of the scenery. He was entrusted with more delicate errands, collecting money, delivering messages that were designed to sound harmless if overheard, but carried heavier meanings to those in the know. Through Lefty, Donnie met higher-ranking members, including men who answered directly to Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano. These meetings were often brief and businesslike. The higher men did not waste words on small talk. Still, the fact that Donnie was present at all meant his position was changing. Lefty was proud of that. He would later brag, in his rough way, that he was the one who had brought Donnie along, that he had seen potential where others had only seen another small-timer. That pride intertwined their fates even more deeply. The intimacy of their relationship reached beyond business. On slow afternoons they would sit in cars on side streets, watching the world go by, and Lefty would complain about his own money troubles with surprising openness. For all the fear his name carried on the street, he rarely had much cash in his pocket. The life did not guarantee comfort, it only guaranteed risk. He described how many years he had spent in and out of prison, how often he had taken the fall for others, how he felt the universe owed him a break it never quite delivered. There was humor in the way he told it, but also a tired resignation. It was like listening to a factory worker talk about a rough supervisor, only in this factory the discipline was enforced with knives and guns instead of write-ups. For Donnie, these conversations were some of the hardest. They gave him a close view of the human cost of the world he was infiltrating. Lefty was not a movie villain. He was a flawed man who had made countless terrible choices, yet he also possessed a complicated loyalty and an almost old-fashioned sense of obligation. Sitting across from him, Joseph felt the split widen inside. As an agent, he knew that bringing down the operations Lefty served was the right thing to do. As a man, he could not ignore the fact that this individual, who had taken him under his wing, would likely pay a heavy price once the truth came out. He could not let that sympathy sour into hesitation. The mission depended on his ability to maintain cover fully. So he did what he had learned to do best. He listened, he remembered, he bore witness quietly. The rules of the life seeped into his habits. If someone greeted him on the street, he noted whether they shook his hand or merely nodded. If a higher-ranking member walked into a room, he made sure to stand or at least acknowledge their presence. Failure to show these small gestures could be read as disrespect, and disrespect had consequences. Lefty drilled such things relentlessly. He corrected Donnie for minor slips, then nodded approvingly when those slips did not repeat. Strangely, the corrections began to feel almost fatherly. It was as if Lefty were moulding him into the kind of man he wished he had been recognized as himself. At the same time, the Bureau intensified its interest. The information Joseph provided through his reports was rich with detail. Names, places, routines. The picture of the Bonanno inner world grew clearer with each passing month, thanks largely to his growing closeness with Lefty. The longer this went on, the more completely his days belonged to the life. Early mornings were reserved for meetings with handlers, the only times he spoke as Joseph. The rest of the day and most of the night belonged to Donnie. He ate with the crew, drank with them, attended social occasions where families mingled and children ran around unaware of the conversations over their heads. He watched Left in those family settings and saw a different version of the man, softer in moments, distracted, almost ordinary. It was another reminder that the categories of good and bad shrank when you got close enough. People were messy bundles of choices, loyalties, and fears. This awareness did not make his work easier. If anything, it made it heavier. Yet it also made it feel more necessary. For every half-charming story Lefty told, there were others he left unspoken that ended in someone unalived, in families grieving, in businesses crushed under illegal pressures. The kindness one man showed in a diner booth could not erase the larger damage caused by the system he served. So Joseph carried both truths, the individual man and the larger machine. He respected the first while working to dismantle the second. By the time another year had turned, Donnie Brasco was no longer merely under Mirror's shadow. He had become, in the eyes of many, Lefty's guy. An associate with promise, a man who might, some whispered, be moving toward becoming a made member someday. It was an illusion, of course. There were lines he could never cross, rituals he would never truly embrace. But the belief that he might was enough. In that belief, doors opened that had been locked to law enforcement for decades. On certain nights, as he drove Lefty home and watched the older man shuffle up the steps of a modest apartment building, Joseph felt the fatigue settle deep in his bones. The weight of the double life, the long hours, the lies told to protect people on both sides, all of it pressed down. Yet when Lefty turned back, hand raised in a small gesture of farewell, Donnie raised his hand in answer without needing to think. The bond was real, even if it was built on a secret that would one day break it. In the quiet that followed those long days, in rooms where no one called him by any name at all, Joseph would sit on the edge of a bed and remind himself why he had said yes in that kitchen in Paterson. He thought about the victims whose names never made the news. Store owners leaning on counters, wondering how to keep up with extortion payments. Families who never knew why someone they loved had simply never come home. Lefty had taught him the rules of the life. The Bureau had taught him different rules. Somewhere between them he walked a narrow path, hoping that when it ended, the scales of harm and protection would tilt in the right direction. For now, though, the work went on. Lefty would call again, and Donnie would answer. Another drive, another lesson, another day deeper inside a world he was meant to expose. Chapter 5. Balancing Home and the Street. On paper, Joseph Dennis Pistone began to fade. It did not happen overnight. The Bureau did not press a magic button and make him vanish. But little by little his name slid off lists. A roster here, a directory there. When someone called an office asking for him, young clerks who had never met him shrugged and said they had no one by that name. In a way, its quiet erasing was the clearest sign that the undercover work had moved into its deep phase. The operation no longer lived only in case folders and briefings. It lived in the strange space where one man carried two lives and neither could exist in full public view. For Joseph, the change showed itself in small moments. Once, during an early morning stop at the field office, he passed a bulletin board and realized his photograph had been taken down. Newer agents, smiling awkwardly for the camera, had taken his place. For a second, he felt oddly like a ghost attending his own going-away party. His handlers called it necessary security. The fewer people who knew where he was and what he was doing, the safer he would be. That logic was solid. He had seen enough cases compromised by careless talk to appreciate the caution. Still, it was a curious feeling for a man sworn to uphold the law to move through his own agency like a rumour. When he stepped back into the world of Donnie Brasco, the contrast was sharp. On the street, his face was becoming more familiar, not less. In the bars and clubs, people greeted him with nods that carried a different kind of recognition. The more he faded on the official side, the clearer he became in the underworld's unofficial ledger. Between those two realities stood his family. They did not get status updates or security briefings. They got phone calls at strange hours, knocked together from a handful of minutes stolen between one meeting and the next. The distance between what he could say and what he wanted to say stretched like a thin wire each time he dialed home from a payphone that smelled of old smoke and cheap disinfectant. He learned to make those calls sound ordinary. How was your day? How are the kids? Did the car behave this week? He asked the small questions that make up the real fabric of family life, even as his mind tracked details from his other conversations, where a certain captain liked to sit in a restaurant, which warehouse was now under whose control. Sometimes, when his wife mentioned a school play or a parent-teacher meeting he had missed, a small tightness pinched behind his ribs. He had become used to risking his life. He was less used to missing the milestones that came and went without violence or headlines. He reminded himself that this was temporary, that the years of undercover work would one day become something his children could look back on as part of a larger story of service. That thought helped, but only up to a point. The human heart often cares more about who shows up at bedtime than who takes down a crime family. There were nights when the line crackled, and he could hear his children in the background, arguing over something trivial. Toys, television, bedtime. Ordinary battles. He would close his eyes and picture them running down the hall of their house, the same house where he had once sat with coffee and case files. Then a siren would wail past the phone booth, or a shadow would move in the corner of his eye, and Donnie would pull him back to the present. He could not tell them where he was. He could not tell them who he sat with when the calls ended. Instead, he spoke in generalities. Work is busy. I am travelling. I will be home when I can. His wife, who had known him long enough to read the spaces between his words, did not press too hard. She heard the strain in his voice and the attempt to keep it light. The lies he told his family were soft ones, meant to protect rather than deceive for his own gain. Still, they weighed on him. A lie is a lie, whether it serves a badge or a bank. He carried that knowledge with a kind of steady acceptance. He had chosen this path. It did not ask permission to be easy. On the street side, the lies had a different flavour. There, he lied about who he was at the foundation level. Name, history, loyalties. Every conversation with Lefty or Mirror rested on that concealed truth. Day after day, he played the quiet jewel thief, the loyal associate who did not ask too many questions. The emotional fatigue came less from sudden shocks and more from the constant need to maintain posture. In the life, you never really relaxed. Even at social gatherings, where wives and children shared tables with crew members, a part of his mind stayed on watch. A careless word, a misremembered detail about his supposed past, could spark suspicion. He found small ways to manage the tension. On nights when he could not go home, he sometimes drove out of the dense city, just far enough to see a strip of trees or a sliver of water. He would sit in the car with the engine off and let the relative silence wrap around him. No jukebox, no arguments at the bar, no Lefty giving instructions. Those moments were brief, but they allowed Joseph to surface inside Donnie for a breath. Once in a while, he managed a short visit home between phases of the operation. Those visits felt both comforting and strange. Walking through the front door, he had to remind himself that here he was Joseph, not Donnie. A habit as simple as scanning every car on the block for danger needed to be dialed down, or at least hidden. His kids did not care who he sat next to in some dark social club. They wanted to know if he would take them to the park or watch a game on television. In those hours, he focused on them with the same sharp attention he usually reserved for suspects. He memorized the way their faces changed as they grew, the way their voices shifted, the way they told him stories about classmates whose names he had never heard before. His wife handled the practical side of things with quiet strength. Bills, school schedules, the little crises that come unannounced. She took care of all of it while he was off pretending to be someone else. Sometimes, when the kids were out of earshot, she would look at him for a long moment and ask if he was being careful. The question hung in the air between them. He answered that he was in the calmest tone he could manage. He did not describe the nights in card rooms where tempers flared, or the times someone had half joked about what would happen to a rat. There was no reason to paint those pictures in her mind. He knew that his absence did not show itself only in missed dinners. It showed itself in the way a child looked to the door at certain hours, expecting him and not find him. It showed itself in the way his wife sometimes set an extra plate without thinking, and then quietly put it back. The Bureau tried to support in the ways it could. There were check-ins, resources, numbers she could call if something urgent came up. But there was no manual for raising a family while your husband pretended to be a criminal for years on end. They made their own manual, page by page, day by day. Back in the life, the men around him assumed that Donnie was simply another street guy with his own domestic mess somewhere out of sight. Some had families they rarely saw. Others drifted through relationships like they drifted through jobs. The life was not kind to permanence. When they did talk about family, it was often with a mix of affection and exasperation. A son who wanted money for something unnecessary, a daughter dating someone they disliked, an argument about rent or groceries. These mundane complaints sat next to talk of scores and debts the way coffee cups sat next to cards and chips. In those moments, Joseph saw clearly how the same man could be two very different people depending on the room. Lefty, who might order something harsh in conversation, could spend the next afternoon worrying about a grandchild. Mirror, who cultivated a reputation for being dangerous, might spend 10 minutes complaining about a leaking sink. It made the moral math harder. It is simple to oppose monsters. It is more complicated to oppose human beings who have chosen monstrous work. Yet that complexity was also the reason he felt the job mattered. If the system of organized crime had been made only of cartoon villains, it would not have lasted so long. It survived because it wrapped itself around real human needs and fears. Late night, after a long string of days away from home, he sat in a motel room that carried the anonymous smell of countless previous guests. The television flickered muted in the corner. On the nightstand sat a phone he had already used to call his family earlier. The echo of their voices still fresh in his mind. He thought about everything the operation had cost so far: sleep, time, peace at home. He thought about everything it might yet cost if something went wrong. Then he thought about the alternative: walking away, letting someone else take the risk, accepting that families like his would continue to live under the shadow of men whose decisions were guided by greed and fear instead of law. The scales tipped in the same direction they always did. He believed, in a quiet, stubborn way, that his presence inside the life could help pull those scales slightly back toward justice. Not all the way, not in some perfect storybook sense, just enough to matter. He did not make a speech to the empty room. He did not even speak the words out loud. But inside, he made a promise to himself that he would see this through as far as he safely could, that he would endure the distance from home and the strain of double living in order to bring out the kind of evidence that would hold in court, not just in conversation. He also promised himself something more personal. When this was over, whenever that time came, he would not let the undercover years swallow the rest of his life. He would return to being a husband and father with the same focus he now gave to being an associate. He knew he could not erase the distance these years had created, but he meant to close it as much as possible. For now, the path still ran between two worlds. In net, he was a fading name on a government roster and a half-explained absence at a dinner table. In the other, he was Donnie Brasco, a rising figure under the wing of a seasoned mobster, trusted just enough to be invited deeper. Tomorrow the phone would ring again, and he would answer to one name or the other, depending on who was on the line. The balancing act would continue with no net below. He turned off the television lay back on the narrow bed and closed his eyes. Somewhere miles away his family was sleeping. Somewhere not far from his motel, men were planning the next day of business. Between them, suspended in the thin dark, he drifted into a shallow, watchful rest. Chapter 6: Sunshine and Shadows in Florida. After so many nights spent under grey New York skies, the Florida light felt almost unfair. It was bright, blunt, and everywhere. It spilled across parking lots, bounced off the chrome of parked cars, and made even the shabbiest buildings look a little less tired. Palm trees lined roads where air hung heavy with salt and exhaust. The scene could have belonged to a travel brochure if not for the business that had brought Donnie and the others down. The trip south was not a vacation, it was an expansion. The Banana Reach did not stop at city limits, money did not like to sit still, and neither did the people who chased it. With connections already forming in New York, it made sense for the crew to explore opportunities in places where tourists and locals mixed, and where nightlife stayed open as long as there were dollars to be spent. On the flight down, Donnie sat among men who acted like they were on a casual trip, joking with each other about the heat they would find and the people they might meet. Underneath the banter lay layers of calculation. Florida was fertile territory. Clubs, bars, and bottle joints that skirted liquor regulations offered perfect cover for the kind of schemes the family liked to run. As the plane descended toward the coastline, Joseph looked out the small window. The view seemed almost too serene. Blue water, white streaks of wake from boats, neat rows of homes and hotels. He thought about how many of those houses probably had no idea what kind of conversations would soon take place not far from their front doors. The King's Court Bottle Club sat in a strip of businesses that could have been anywhere near a beach. On the outside, it looked like a regular night spot with a slightly grand name. Inside, it operated under a setup that allowed patrons to store their own bottles and buy mixers, sidestepping certain alcohol laws. This also allowed plenty of room for creative accounting. When Donnie first walked in, the place smelled of spilled drinks and new carpet. Coloured lights washed the walls in soft, shifting tones. Music drifted from speakers, a constant thump that blurred conversation just enough to make eavesdropping tricky for outsiders, but still manageable for someone seated at the same table. The club quickly became a hub for gathering, planning, and quiet negotiation. Out front, couples and small groups moved between tables, talking loud enough to be heard over the music. In the back, behind a door that looked ordinary to anyone not paying attention, business conversations took on a different tone. Working out of a club like King's Court required a different rhythm than the New York bars. The sunshine and casual clothes made everything feel looser on the surface, but beneath the short sleeves and open collars, the same sharp instincts lurked. Men who had grown up in city tenements adjusted to the heat, but not to the idea of relaxing their standards of suspicion. It was here that another key figure stepped more clearly into Donnie's world. Dominic's sunny black Napolitano carried a different energy than Mira or even Lefty SC. Where Mira was quick-tempered and Lefty was constantly talking, Sunny Black had a steadier presence. He moved with the calm assurance of a man used to being listened to. His voice did not need to rise to command attention. Donnie had already crossed paths with him in New York, but Florida offered more chances to see him in action. Sunny Black had responsibilities, and the club was part of a larger plan to widen business streams. He was the kind of man who preferred order even in illegal enterprises. He liked knowing who handled what, how the money flowed, and which faces belonged in which rooms. At King's Court, Donnie found himself often in proximity to Sunny Black, thanks in part to Lefty's pride in showing off his protégé. The older man would talk up Donnie's skills in front of Sunny, emphasizing his reliability, his eye for merchandise, his steady nerves. Sunny listened, taking mental notes the way men in his position always did. Conversations in the Florida heat had a different soundtrack than those in New York. Palm fronds rustled outside, and the distant roar of traffic mingled with the club music. Inside, Sunny spoke about the possibilities the location offered. More customers with loose wallets, more chance to skim, to loan, to extend influence. Donnie watched and learned. He paid attention not only to what Sonny said but to how others reacted, who laughed too quickly, who waited for Sonny to speak before forming an opinion. The hierarchies that had been hinted at in New York now stood in clearer relief under the bright lights of a club trying to look casual. The work itself shifted slightly. In New York, Donnie had moved mostly within a world of hijacks, card games, and backroom deals. In Florida, he found himself handling matters connected to the club and to the networks that grew around it, setting up introductions between local operators and banana men, ensuring that the right people were taken care of and the wrong people were discouraged, politely at first. Still, some things remained the same. The need to present as loyal and useful, the constant balancing act between being visible enough to matter and invisible enough to avoid drawing dangerous curiosity from rival groups or law enforcement. For Joseph, there was an odd irony in working under the bright Florida sun to dig deeper into shadows. During slow moments, he would step outside the club and stand for a few minutes in the heat, letting the light soak into his face. To anyone watching, he might have looked like a man grabbing a breath of fresh air. Inside, he was reminding himself that there was a world beyond the dim rooms and coded talk. The change of setting also stretched the distance between him and his family even further. Phone calls now jumped more miles. Time zones made their own small mischief. When he called in the evening, it might already be late at home. The kids asked if he was somewhere warm. He said yes and described the sun in general terms, careful not to get specific about cities or streets. Back at the club, the days and nights blurred. One afternoon might bring a sit-down with local figures who wanted a piece of what the family could offer. Another night might involve smoothing over a conflict between a bartender and a patron who thought he should be comped more than was reasonable. Sonny Black watched how Donnie handled these smaller matters. He noticed that Donnie did not rush to violence or even to threats. He preferred to talk, to find compromise, to guide situations back toward calm. In their world, that kind of steady hand was valuable. A man who could keep things cool until heat was truly needed saved everyone trouble. Over time, Sonny began to include Donnie in conversations that revealed more of the strategic picture. Note full details, never everything, but enough to show trust. Plans to use the club not only as a place to make money but as a cover for other operations. Schemes involving loans, gambling, and potential ventures in other parts of Florida. The Bureau followed this expansion with keen interest. Through Joseph's reports, they gained insight into how the family projected power beyond their home turf. They learned who in Florida was willing to partner with New York crews and who preferred to stay independent. They saw patterns of investment and pressure that would later form the backbone of wider cases. Meanwhile, Lefty continued to play his role as mentor and commentator. He seemed almost younger in Florida, enjoying the small status bump that came from being seen as part of a crew entrusted with new ground. He taught Donnie how things translated to this different landscape, which local expressions meant trouble, which restaurants were safe, which beaches to avoid after dark. He did not stop complaining about money. Even in the sun, Lefty found reasons to grumble about how much the family took and how little trickled down. Donnie listened, nodded, and occasionally defused the grousing with a wry remark. Their rapport had become familiar enough to survive the change of scenery. One evening, after a long day of dealing with minor disputes over club percentages, Donnie walked alone along a stretch of beach. The sand still held the heat of the day. The surf rolled in and out with a steady hush, a rhythmic sound far kinder than the clatter of bar glasses. He thought about how far he was from Paterson, geographically and otherwise. The boy who had watched men in suits at his father's bar could not have imagined standing here as a trusted associate of a crime family, carrying secrets in both directions. The distance between that boy and the man he now was felt both immense and strangely small. On the sand, there were couples walking hand in hand, families with children chasing waves, solitary joggers moving with headphones and steady breaths. None of them knew that a few blocks inland, men were discussing deals that might reshape parts of their city. None of them knew that a federal agent walked among those men, collecting information like shells. Joseph found a certain peace in that contrast. Life went on. People fell in love, argued about groceries, planned vacations. The world did not stop spinning just because he attended meetings with Sonny Black and reported back to the bureau. In some way, that was the point. His work aimed to keep those ordinary cycles from being crushed too heavily by the hidden machinery of organized crime. He stood for a while, letting the wind off the water cool his face, then turned back toward the line of lights that marked the streets. The King's Court Bottle Club would be waking up for another night. Sonny would be there, checking on his piece of the operation. Lefty would be at his side or holding court at a table, a drink in hand and a story ready. Donnie would walk in through the front like any other regular, nod to the staff, and slip into his role. Back inside, the music wrapped around him again. The club staff moved with practiced efficiency. As the night deepened, specific conversations began to branch off from the general chatter. In a small back room, Sonny spoke with him about numbers and names, eyes running over handwritten notes that would never see daylight outside these walls. Here, in this place of neon and noise, the bonds between them tightened. Sonny saw in Donnie a man who could be trusted with sensitive tasks. Lefty saw in him proof of his own good judgment. The crime family saw a valuable asset growing in their garden. The bureau saw something else. Through Joseph, they saw a path to mapping more of the network. The Florida venture was not a side trip. It was another piece of a larger puzzle, one whose final picture still lay years away. Late that night, when the last customers had drifted out and staff began to clean, Donnie leaned against the bar for a moment, watching a bartender wipe down glass surfaces until they shone in the dim light. The music had been turned off. The club, stripped of its show, looked almost ordinary. He thought of all the roles a place like this played. To some it was a late-night escape, to others a workplace, to the family a revenue stream and a cover. To him it was a field office of sorts, a place where conversations fed into reports that would never be pinned to any public bulletin board. The Florida air, still warm even in the small hours, seeped in through the front door each time someone stepped out. Sunshine and shadows, he thought. That was the job. That was his life now. Moving between bright scenes and hidden motives, between open beaches and closed rooms. He straightened up, said a quiet goodnight to the remaining staff, and stepped outside. The night felt thick but not oppressive. Somewhere, a car radio played a song too faint to recognize. Somewhere else, in another part of the city, a family slept. He headed toward his car, the sound of the surf a distant murmur behind him, and prepared to carry back everything he had seen and heard into the next round of reports. The sun would rise again soon enough. With it would come more deals, more conversations, more chances for Donnie Brasco to glide through the mix, a calm figure in a storm that most people never knew was there. Chapter 7. Lines that cannot be crossed. There came a season when the air itself felt sharper. You could taste it in the way conversations shifted mid-sentence. You could feel it in the pauses that fell a little too long after certain names were spoken. In the life, trouble rarely announced itself loudly. It came as a change in tone, a narrowing of eyes, a sudden new caution in men who usually coasted through the day on habit. Donnie Brasco noticed it first in the bars. At tables where the crew used to joke freely, laughter now came in shorter bursts. Certain stories were no longer told, or were told only to a tighter circle. The word on the street was that higher up in the family, pressure was building. Power was moving around like furniture in a dark room. When that happened, people close to the ground could easily get their feet crushed. Round card tables there was more talk of who was in and who was out. Men speculated quietly about bosses and captains, about sit-downs that stretched late into the night. No one knew all the details, and those who knew some pretended to know less, but one thing was clear. The family was adjusting to some kind of internal storm. For Joseph, listening from behind the face of Donnie, these shifts were more than gossip. They were signals that physical danger might be moving closer. When positions at the top changed, there were often consequences lower down. People who backed the wrong person could find themselves suddenly on the wrong side of a decision. In that climate, talk of unaliving grew more frequent. Men used phrases everyone understood but that could not be easily quoted. Someone might say that a certain guy was not going to be around much longer. or that another had a problem that needed to be straightened out. The meaning behind the words was clear enough. The first time the tension drew Donnie directly into its orbit, it happened in the quiet way that serious things often do. He was sitting in a booth across from Lefty, coffee growing cold between them. The diner around them hummed with ordinary life. Silverware clinked. A server refilled cups. In the background, a radio murmured a song no one was really listening to. Lefty, as usual, was talking. He spoke of money, of respect, of how people forgot who had put them where they were. His complaints took a slightly different angle than usual. There was more edge, more glance over the shoulder. After circling the subject for a while, he finally landed closer to the truth. There was someone causing trouble, he said. Someone whose loyalty was in question. The kind of situation that could not be handled with a simple talk. Something bigger might be coming, and when that happened, certain men would be expected to step up, to show what side they were on. He studied Donnie as he spoke, watching for any sign of discomfort. Donnie kept his face calm. He knew this conversation had been building. You could not stand as close to the core of a family like this without eventually being asked to help with more than collecting envelopes and smoothing over bar fights. Lefty hinted that if a job came down, he would want Donnie with him. He framed it as a compliment. Only a man he trusted fully could be by his side in that kind of moment. It was, in the twisted logic of the life, a kind of affection. Joseph felt the weight of that trust settle on him like fresh concrete. He nodded slowly, neither eager nor hesitant. In their world, refusal was not really an option at that table. Any hint that he did not want to be involved would plant the seed that he lacked the stomach for the serious side of the life. That seed could grow into suspicion, and suspicion could grow into a very short future. Inside, though, he was already drawing a line. Long before this conversation, he had decided that he would never personally take part in unaliving anyone. He had made his peace with deception, with living as another man, even with breaking certain laws of association for the greater purpose of the investigation. But there was a boundary he could not cross and still recognize himself when he looked in a mirror. The trick now would be to keep that inner line intact, while presenting an outer face that looked ready for anything. After the diner, he met with his handlers in a car a safe distance away. No offices, no obvious briefcases, just 3 men in a parked vehicle, blending into a city full of parked vehicles. He described the conversation with Lefty in precise detail, the tone, the hints, the way the older man had framed the possible job as a step up. The handlers listened with the kind of concentration that stripped away all casualness. They understood the danger of this new turn. If the crew did plan a violent act, and Donnie was expected to be there, the Bureau would have both a legal and moral problem on its hands. They began working on contingency plans, ways to steer him away from direct involvement if something specific was scheduled, ways to intervene if the situation moved faster than expected. In the quiet space of that car, it became clear that the operation had entered a sharper phase. Still, they could not simply pull him out. He was too deep, too valuable, and for the moment, not yet on the edge of a specific act. What they had was warning, not certainty. In undercover work, those two things feel very different. The days that followed stretched his nerves thin, though he tried not to show it. Lefty and others spoke more frequently about certain names, about who might be backing whom in internal disputes. Donnie sat in the middle of those talks, nodding, occasionally adding a small remark, never saying more than his role required. Once, in a car ride with Sonny Black, the subject surfaced more directly. Sonny, eyes on the road, spoke in a calm voice about the nature of their life, how everyone understood the rules when they signed up, how sometimes, for the good of the family, hard decisions had to be carried out by men who had proven their loyalty. He told Donnie that the measure of a man in their world was not how loudly he talked at the bar, but how steady he stood when the serious work needed doing. He did not spell out what serious meant. He did not have to, Donnie replied carefully. He spoke of loyalty, of standing by the men who had stood by him, of doing what needed to be done when it truly mattered. Every sentence was technically true in spirit, even if Joseph silently defined what needed to be done in a different way than Sonny did. Later that night, lying awake in a rented room, he examined the balance of his life once again. He had watched the mob world from the inside long enough to know that refusing a direct order to help unalive someone would likely mean his own death. These were not people who accepted moral objections with a shrug. At the same time, agreeing and following through would cross a line he had set long before joining the Bureau. Between those two impossible choices lay the hope that he, and his supervisors, could keep him near the edge without letting him fall over it. The Bureau, for its part, tightened the net from outside. Surveillance increased where they could safely manage it. Intelligence units listened harder to rumors about pending actions. The goal was to identify any specific planned act early enough to pull Donnie clear without tipping their hand. From Donnie's perspective, the strain showed itself in smaller ways. His sleep grew lighter. Even in relatively safe spaces, his body stayed half-coiled, ready for a knock on the door or a late-night call summoning him to something he did not want to see. He caught himself, more than once, imagining different ways a situation might be delayed or redirected without arousing suspicion. A car breaking down on the way to a meeting. A sudden police presence on a street. A minor arrest that forced people to postpone plans. In another life, perhaps he might have tried to arrange such delays himself. In this witch, he knew that any obvious pattern of bad luck around him would light up the kind of suspicion he could not control, so he walked the tightrope. Go where he was told, but always slightly off to the side of whatever was happening. Arrive late enough that actual violence had already taken place elsewhere. Be assigned the tasks around the edges, the driving, the waiting outside, the follow-up conversations. It was not a perfect shield. Even being near that kind of work left a mark, but it allowed him to gather information about the who and why without personally wielding the final act. Lefty, perhaps sensing the shift but not the source of Joseph's inattention, doubled down on his teachings. He spoke more about what it meant to be a real man in the life, how fear was normal, but backing down was not allowed. He took Donnie's quiet as proof of toughness rather than conflict. Once, while the two of them sat in a parked car watching a building across the street, Lefty spoke about people he had known who had failed to live up to expectations. He described how quickly their names vanished from conversation, how little their earlier talk and bravado counted in the end. Donnie listened, hands steady on the wheel. He thought about how different his own vanish would be if his cover were blown. There would be no quiet fading. There would be a sudden, violent end. Not for him, but likely for Lefty and others who had vouched for him. That realization added another layer to the moral weight he carried. His presence, meant to dismantle a dangerous network, had become a potential death sentence for men who, despite their deeds, had come to rely on him. The nights grew longer, the rumors grew louder, yet through it all no specific command came that forced the ultimate crisis. Jobs were discussed, then shifted. Targets were mentioned, then reconsidered. The constant internal maneuvering within the family created delays that, unintentionally, bought Joseph time. He did not mistake that for safety. He knew that any day some long-running feud could sharpen into a decision that involved him. Until then, all he could do was prepare, stay alert, and trust that his handlers would act fast if the line he could not cross loomed directly in front of him. In private moments he tried to ease his mind with simple routines. A slow cup of coffee alone before stepping back into the life. A brief phone call home to hear his children's voices, even if he could not tell them why his own sounded a little thinner. A walk around a block just to feel the ordinary rhythm of traffic and strangers who did not know his name. Through it all, he maintained the outer calm that had carried him this far. In the bars, he still leaned casually against counters. At tables, he still watched more than he spoke. With Lefty and Sonny, he still played the reliable associate. Inside, though, the line he had drawn stood bright and firm. He would not be the one to pull the trigger on another human being. He would risk his life, his safety, his reputation. That line he kept for himself. The chapter of his life unfolding in that time was not about car chases or dramatic confrontations. It was about the quiet, constant negotiation between who he needed to appear to be and who he refused to become. As the internal storms of the Bonanno family swirled higher overhead, he walked on, one careful step at a time, hoping that the path he had chosen would lead in the end to fewer people unalived rather than more. Chapter 8. Storm Inside the Family. If the earlier years of the operation had been like slipping into a darkened theatre, the next phase felt more like watching the backstage ropes come loose. The Bonanno family, which from the outside had long appeared as a single solid block of power, began to show cracks. That did not mean the group was suddenly weak. It meant that inside, men with influence were shuffling chairs, whispering in corners, gathering allies. For someone standing where Donnie Brasco stood, those shifts were impossible to ignore. He heard more talk of meetings that took place behind heavier doors, sit-downs that lasted well past midnight. Men who used to appear relaxed at bars now kept checking watches and looking toward the entrances, as if waiting for news that might change their fortunes. Names floated through conversations with increased frequency. Some belonged to old guard figures worried about their positions. Others belonged to younger men eager to rise. The crew speculated about who favored which side, which captain might be on the way up, who might be in quiet trouble. In this atmosphere, Sonny Black became an even more important figure in Donnie's daily world. Sonny had always given off an air of order. Now he seemed intent on tightening that order within his sphere, perhaps as a way to counter the chaos drifting down from above. He wanted his crew tight, loyal, and efficient. He did not appreciate surprises. Donnie spent more time in Sonny's orbit. At bars, he sat closer to him. In meetings, he was often the one taking mental notes while Sonny talked through plans with other men. Lefty remained a constant presence, but even he sometimes stepped back a little when Sonny was in full command mode. At times, Sonny would call Donnie aside for quiet conversations, walking down a side street or in a corner of a bar where the jukebox helped muffle their voices. He would talk about stability. He spoke of how the family had to present a united front to outside forces, even when there were arguments inside. He stressed the importance of keeping money flowing up and trouble flowing down into manageable channels. He did not speak to Donnie as a newcomer anymore. He spoke to him as someone whose actions could affect the crew in real ways. That shift in tone carried its own weight. To be treated as important was flattering for Donnie the character. For Joseph the agent, it meant even greater responsibility to transmit what he heard accurately and quickly. The Bureau responded accordingly. Each report he gave was now part of a moving picture, in which the lines between factions mattered almost as much as the identities of individuals. Analysts pieced together where Sonny stood in relation to other power players, which moves might benefit him, which might threaten him. Meanwhile, on the ground, the signs of turbulence became more visible. Men who had once been regular faces in certain haunts began to disappear from the daily scene. Sometimes there were explanations. A man had gone away for a while, a term that might mean prison, or might mean something more final. Other times there was no explanation at all, just an empty seat and a quiet avoidance of questions. Donnie learned to track these absences as carefully as he tracked new introductions. A missing person in a network like this could indicate a shift in alliances or a warning to others. When those absences piled up, the message was hard to ignore. He felt the unease most clearly in the way people lowered their voices when speaking of higher-level decisions. The usual bravado that coloured many of the men's talk had thinned. In its place was a more thoughtful caution. Not all of them were deep thinkers, but all of them understood self-preservation. During this period, Sonny leaned heavily on his inner circle, and Donnie found himself pulled closer into that ring. On more than one occasion, Sonny asked him to accompany him to meetings that had very little to do with jewel theft and everything to do with political positioning. Donnie would sit, sometimes saying almost nothing, while Sonny met with other figures to discuss territory, money, and the expectations of the family leadership. The specifics of those talks varied. Some were about disputes between crews over who controlled which rackets, others concerned how to respond to pressure from law enforcement. There was talk of surveillance, of possible informants, of how to keep sensitive matters out of earshot. The irony of those last conversations was not lost on Joseph. He sat at tables where men pledged to keep rats out, while he himself was passing details of their plans along to the bureau. The only way to survive that contradiction was to keep his demeanor steady and his information accurate. The internal storm eventually produced louder thunder. There were times when word filtered down that someone had been taken out. The language used in the crew was always indirect. People said that a man was gone, that he was no longer with them, that he had paid for a mistake. There was rarely mention of how, and Donnie did not ask. He let others fill in their own details, nodding in a way that suggested he understood. The reality of death hung behind the words, but the story he told in his reports focused on decisions and hierarchy rather than physical acts. The cumulative effect of these events was a tightening circle of trust around Sonny and those closest to him. He wanted people he could count on in uncertain times. Lefty believed that his association with Donnie reflected well on him, and he made sure Sonny was aware of Donnie's reliability. One evening, as they drove through the city after a long day of business, Sonny and Donnie shared a rare moment of relative quiet. The traffic had thinned, the sky was dark, and the streetlights drew long, repeating lines on the hood of the car. The traffic had thinned, the sky was dark, and the streetlights drew long, repeating lines on the hood of the car. Sonny spoke then, not as a man issuing orders, but as someone reflecting aloud. He talked about how long he had been in the life, how many changes he had seen. Bosses rising, bosses gone, crews rearranged, people he had known since they were kids now sitting in prison or lying in graves. He said that what mattered most in all of it was knowing who you could trust when things got rough. Men who did not fold, did not run, did not switch sides at the first sign of trouble. As he spoke, he turned his head slightly, giving Donnie a look that made the meaning clear. He was counting him in that group. Joseph felt the gravity of that regard. For Sonny, trusting Donnie was an act of survival as well as friendship. If Donnie proved false, it would not only be a personal betrayal. It would also mean that Sonny, a man with authority, had failed to recognize a danger standing next to him. In their world, that kind of mistake was often fatal. On the bureau side, analysts watching the unfolding storm saw Sonny as a key target. His position, his decisions, his connections to the Florida ventures and New York operations made him central. The case against him and others would eventually become one of the crown pieces of the investigation. In the meantime, Joseph continued to build the mosaic one conversation at a time. He sharpened his already strong habit of keeping records in his head. The deeper the internal conflict grew, the more risky it became to jot anything down. Pieces of paper could be found, notes could be misread. A forgotten scrap in a pocket could be the end of everything. Instead, he relied on repetition. After leaving a meeting, he would often take a long drive alone, repeating key points aloud in an empty car. Names, places, decisions, reactions. He would say them until they felt etched into his mind, then later pour them out in careful, structured reports to his handlers. It was a strange way to live, carrying so many other people's secrets in his head. Some days he felt like nothing more than a walking tape recorder. Other days the burden felt more personal, because these secrets did not belong only to criminals. They also brushed the edges of his own life, his own safety, the safety of his family. As the internal conflict continued, he saw more clearly how the life consumed its own. Men who had given decades to the family were suddenly on the wrong side of a new arrangement. Their loyalty did not shield them. Their history did not grant them automatic mercy. Watching this churn reinforced his sense that there was no safe retirement from this world. The promises it made about honor and belonging were built on unstable ground. Today you were vital, tomorrow you might be a problem to solve. He imagined, sometimes, what might happen when the truth about him came out, as he knew it must one day. Sonny, Lefty, Mirror, all of them would view him not only as an enemy, but as the worst kind of enemy, one who had stood beside them and nodded while silently documenting their lives. He took no pleasure in that future. The prospect of certain men being unalived for having trusted him sat heavily on his conscience. Yet he also knew that the larger structure they served had unalived far more people than any one operation could count. In that tension, he carried on. The storm inside the family was not of his making, but he was an observer close enough to feel the spray from its waves. From the outside, the city went on as always. Delivery trucks rumbled through grey mornings, kids went to school, couples argued in grocery aisles over what to buy for dinner. Most of them would never hear the names that occupied so much of his mental space. They would never know how close internal power struggles came to shaping the streets they walked. That gap between ordinary life and the life he lived daily as Donnie gave Joseph a strange kind of hope. The world was bigger than the crime families. No matter how dramatic the internal storms felt from inside, they were just one layer in a much wider sky. The storm inside the Bonanno family would continue to build. It would eventually break in ways that changed not only their structure, but the course of the operation itself. For now, Donnie Brasco continued to move through the weather. He sat with Sonny Black as plans were laid. He rode with Lefty as complaints were aired and loyalties reaffirmed. He stood in bars where people glanced over their shoulders more often than they used to. And each night, as he stepped away from that world for a few brief hours, he gathered up the pieces of what he had heard and prepared to hand them over, trusting that somewhere in the calm offices of the Bureau, people were turning his observations into something that might, one day, help quiet these storms for good. Chapter 9. The End of the Masquerade. Operations like his rarely ended with a sudden crash. They ended with a conversation. For Joseph, the conversation came in a parked car on a grey afternoon, the kind of New York day that made everything look like an old photograph. He sat in the front seat, a coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder, while two supervisors in plain clothes took turns talking. They did not waste time on flattery. They spoke in the calm, tight language of people who had been in too many briefings to pretend things were simple. The short version was this. The operation had reached a point where pulling more information out of Donnie Brasco meant putting Joseph Pistone in front of too much danger. The internal storm inside the Bonanno family was still swirling. People were being moved around, taken out, pushed aside. Suspicion was in the air like dust. And Donnie was very close to the center of it all, close enough that a small shift in the wind could carry his name into the wrong ear. At the same time, the Bureau had more than it had dreamed of when this all began. Names, structures, methods, connections that had been rumor and speculation were now mapped with painful clarity. Years of Joseph's reports had built a case file that felt less like paper and more like a weight you could hold in both hands. The supervisors laid out the plan. Soon, not in a vague someday way but in a real scheduled way, the Bureau would move. Indictments, arrests, a public unveiling of what had been growing in the shadows, and before that happened, the man called Donnie Brasco needed to vanish. Joseph listened with his usual quiet focus. He had expected this conversation eventually. No undercover role lasted forever. Logic said he should be relieved. The tension of walking the tightrope, the constant fear that wrong word would end him, all of that would finally let up. Instead, he felt something more complex. Relief, yes, but also a kind of grief. For all its danger, the life he had been living as Donnie had structure. He knew the schedule. He knew who would be at which table, who would call him first thing in the afternoon, who would be waiting in the passenger seat with a new story and a new complaint. He knew that if he walked into certain bars, he could predict the greeting he would get. Walking away meant leaving that world behind completely. It meant turning people who trusted him into people who would one day hear that he was the worst thing they could imagine. His supervisors understood the cost in their own way. They reminded him, gently but firmly, of why he had gone in. The victims who had never seen justice. The businesses crushed under illegal pressure. The lives unalived or twisted by a system that thrived on fear. The operation had not been an abstract exercise. It had been a long, careful attempt to limit the reach of that harm. Even so, when they asked if he understood that it was time to come out, he had to take a slow breath before answering. He said yes, in the same steady tone he had used years earlier in his Paterson kitchen. Then he sat back and let the decision settle into his bones. Donnie had been growing in him for years. Now, in a matter of days, that persona would be cut away close to the skin. There were practical steps to handle. They could not simply stop showing up and hope no one noticed. People like Sonny Black and Lefty did not ignore sudden absences. The Bureau worked through ways to ease Donnie out without raising immediate alarms. Small changes in routine, slight excuses, trips that made sense on the surface. At the same time, preparations for the public side of things picked up speed. Prosecutors consulted stacks of reports, agents gathered photographs, surveillance notes, recordings. The picture of the Banana world with Sonny and others at its core was almost ready to be put on display in courtrooms and news stories. In the middle of all this, Joseph still had to live the life, at least for a little while longer. He continued to meet with Lefty, to sit across from Sonny, to play cards and drink coffee and talk about money. Each moment now carried an odd double exposure. On one layer, Donnie was fully present, nodding, listening, joking in that understated way they had come to expect. On another layer, Joseph was quietly counting down. He found himself noticing details with a new intensity. The way Lefty tapped his cigarette against the ashtray before launching into another story. The way Sonny paused for half a second before making a decision, eyes drifting toward the window as if double-checking some inner map. The way certain bars smelled, the way the lights slanted through certain windows at certain times of day. He knew he would never see those scenes in the same way again, if at all. His undercover work had been built on observation. Now, at the end, that habit was working overtime, trying to collect a last few images before the curtain fell. One of the hardest tasks ahead was simple on the surface. Say goodbye without saying goodbye. He could not stand up in the middle of a bar and declare that it had been an honor fooling everyone. He could not even tell a single person on that side of his life the truth. All he could do was let Donnie drift away in the way of so many other men who took a trip or caught a case and never quite came back. With Lefty, this was harder than with anyone else. The older man had staked reputation and pride on Donnie. He had argued for him, vouched for him, practically adopted him into his own twisted family tree. To simply vanish on him felt cruel. Yet telling him the truth would have been worse. It would have been a death sentence. So Joseph did the one thing he could. In their last days together, he gave Lefty as much respectful attention as possible. He listened to every story, even the ones he had heard more times than he could count. He laughed at the worn jokes. He took the lectures. He drove the late-night rides. At some point, Lefty mentioned small dreams he still carried. Better money, a little more comfort, maybe a day when things would ease up. It was clear that the life had never really delivered on its promises to him. He was still chasing the break that had been just around the corner for decades. Hearing that, Joseph felt the familiar dull ache. Before all of this, before Donnie, there had been a time when Lefty might have chosen a different road. That time was gone, lost in thousands of decisions. Now, whatever happened after the operation ended, his path would be bent again by events he did not control. When the moment finally came to step away, it came quietly. There was a day when certain meetings did not happen, a phone call that did not get answered, a bar stool that stayed empty. People noticed, of course, but at first they shrugged it off. Men in that world sometimes went out of town. Sometimes they got grabbed on another matter. Sometimes they lay low. While they speculated, the Bureau moved. Early morning knocks at doors. Agents in windbreakers spreading through hallways and stairwells. Papers served, rights read. Men who had spent years gliding through shadows now found themselves under bright lights in booking rooms. Joseph was not there for those knocks. He watched the news coverage later, from a place far away from the blocks where he had once walked as Donnie. Reporters spoke of a major operation against the Bonanno family. They listed charges. They named names. Some of those names belonged to men who had once called him their friend. He saw Sonny Black's name among the headlines. He saw references to operations in Florida, to the King's Court Bottle Club, to hijacks and loans and a network that stretched across states. He saw the word racketeering repeated with the dry emphasis of legal language. The real story of what happened to some of the men afterward carried more pain than any public report. Sonny himself, Joseph would later learn, paid a severe price once the family discovered the depth of the infiltration. In that world, being responsible for letting an undercover agent so close was an unforgivable sin. As for Left, the fallout hit him too. The revelation that Donnie Brasco had never been who he claimed to be landed like a hammer. For a man who prided himself on knowing the life, realizing that he had opened the door for an agent cut deep. Joseph carried all of that knowledge quietly. It rested beside the fact that his work had led to many indictments and ultimately convictions. The case reshaped how law enforcement understood and attacked organized crime. It protected future victims whose names he would never know. These two truths were not neat opposites. They sat together, uncomfortable companions. On one side, justice. On the other, the human cost wrung from men who had chosen a criminal life, but who were still, undeniably, human. In the days after the operation became public, he began the process of shifting fully back into being Joseph Pistone. It was not as simple as removing a mask. Years of habits did not fall away overnight. He still caught himself scanning every room automatically, positioning himself with his back to the wall, listening for danger in casual talk. He still reached for the word Donnie on his tongue before correcting himself silently. At night, he sometimes dreamed of bars and card games, of Lefty's voice giving advice in that worn, raspy tone. Waking up took a moment. For a few heartbeats, he did not know which life he was in. The Bureau guided him through debriefings that felt part therapy, part legal preparation. He told the story of the operation from his side again and again, to agents, prosecutors, and eventually to defense lawyers across courtroom floors. He learned to describe years of his life in orderly segments, stripped of the emotional color that had filled them at the time. In court, he sat at the witness stand under another kind of bright light. Lawyers asked questions in crisp voices. Judges listened. Juries watched. The men seated at the defense table sometimes stared at him with a mix of disbelief and fury. To them, he was not a dedicated agent. He was the betrayal that had walked into their living rooms. He told the truth calmly, sticking to facts. Times, places, conversations, deals. He did not use harsh language. He did not gloat. He answered each question as if it were another report, another note added to the file. When verdicts came down, some with long sentences attached, he felt a kind of quiet exhaustion instead of triumph. The work had done what it was supposed to do. The masquerade had ended. The system he had infiltrated had been wounded badly, in ways that would echo for years. But behind every legal success lay the memory of a ride in a car, a cup of coffee in a booth, a laugh in a bar. Those impressions did not vanish with a judge's gavel. The end of the masquerade was not a moment. It was a series of letting go. Letting go of Donnie, of the daily calls from Lefty, of the constant presence of Sonny. Letting go of the identity that had nearly swallowed his own. Letting go of the belief that he could live in that world forever and then quietly return home unchanged. He had paid his price. His family had paid theirs. Now it was time to see what could be rebuilt from the pieces left behind. Chapter 10. Living in the Shadows, Sleeping at Night. When the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, Joseph Dennis Pistone still had to live a life. It was a life that now required a different kind of caution. The danger of being exposed as an undercover agent among the Bananos had passed in none sense. The operation was over, his role revealed. But exposure carried its own long tail of risk. Men who felt betrayed did not always forgive. Some of them were behind bars now, some were not. So Joseph stepped into a quieter, more controlled existence, one with softened edges and careful routines. He moved under protection, new addresses, new routes. Familiar neighborhoods were replaced with places where his face did not stir old memories. The simple act of going to a grocery store or taking a walk required more planning than it had back in the days when his greatest cover was just being another working man in Paterson. Names became delicate things. There were situations where he was still Joseph, at least on paper. There were other situations where he was introduced under yet another identity, one crafted not for infiltrating criminals this time, but for living without attracting the wrong kind of attention. In this new phase, the stakes were less about gathering evidence and more about staying safely forgettable. The Bureau remained a presence, but not in the undercover way. Now they were guardians, coordinators, navigators of the strange middle space between full anonymity and the reality that his story, in a broad sense, had become well known. Books would eventually be written, films would be made. The name Donnie Brasco would carry its own strange echo in the wider culture. Yet the real man behind that name still needed to shop for groceries, pay bills, and figure out how to explain his work to neighbors without actually explaining it. His family, who had spent years living with partial truths, now learned more of the story. Not every detail. Some things were held back for their sake, but enough that they could understand what the distance and the danger had been for. The long absences, the strange phone calls, the sudden shifts in mood. It was not simply that he had been busy. He had been walking a razor between two worlds. They had their own adjustments to make. Living under protection meant changes in schools, in routines, in friendships. People asked questions that could not be fully answered. Why the move? Why the hush? Why the careful way their parents looked at new acquaintances? Over time, they built a new sense of normal. Not the same as the old and in Paterson, but a pattern with its own comforts. Family dinners where everyone was actually at the table. Weekends that did not require Joseph to slip away for meetings in bars. Nights where he could fall asleep without worrying about being summoned to a card game that might end with a whispered decision in a parking lot. He did not stop working. In many ways, his job simply changed shape. Now he was a key witness, a resource, a man called upon to testify in additional cases or to help other agents understand how organized crime operated from the inside. There were days spent in courthouse corridors, the air cool and dry, the walls lined with framed photographs of judges and past officials. He would sit on benches waiting to be called, watching lawyers hurry past with stacks of files. It was a different kind of tension from the back rooms of bars, but tension all the same. On the stand, he told his story so many times that it became almost like reading from a script. Yet beneath the practiced delivery, he still felt each memory as he recounted it. Lefty's lectures, Sonny's measured words, the feeling of walking into a bar not knowing if someone had found out something they should not know. Some nights after testifying, he would go home and sit quietly in a darkened living room, letting the past unwind behind his eyes. He did not dwell on the most dangerous moments. Instead, he found himself thinking about smaller scenes, a car ride with the window cracked open to let in city air, a bartender wiping the same glass 3 times while listening to a story, a flash of laughter at some joke about the weather. Those small memories made the people he had once moved among feel real again, in ways that court language could not capture. It was a reminder that his undercover years had not been spent in a world of cardboard villains. They had been spent among flawed, complicated human beings who had chosen a destructive path. To make sense of that experience, he eventually began to put it into larger form. Speaking to groups, consulting on training, cooperating when others wanted to tell the story of Donnie Brasco in ways the public could understand. He did so carefully, always balancing the need to educate and warn with the need to protect the details that might still put people at risk. In his talks, he emphasized the patient nature of undercover work, the long days of nothing special, the slow accumulation of trust, the importance of listening more than speaking. He also spoke about the cost, the distance imposed on family life, the steady pressure on the mind, the way pretending for so long could blur the edges of who you felt you were. People often asked if he would do it again. He would pause before answering, not for effect, but because the question deserved real thought. The years undercover had taken things from him that could not be fully restored. Time with his children, simple peace of mind when walking down a street, a sense of easy trust in friendships. But they had also saved lives in ways not all of the public would ever see. They had led to convictions that weakened a criminal network that had thrived on fear for decades. They had provided a template for future infiltrations that would help law enforcement across the country. So he usually answered yes, not with romance or bravado, but with the acceptance of a man who understood both sides of the ledger. At home, life gradually settled into a rhythm that looked almost ordinary from the outside. Mornings with coffee at a kitchen table that did not belong to a house in Paterson but served the same purpose. Afternoons that involved errands instead of surveillance. Evenings when he could sit on a couch with his family, watching television without one ear tuned for a ringing phone. He remained cautious, of course. Looking over his shoulder in a parking lot became less of a reflex over time, but never quite vanished. Faces in crowds still triggered quick assessments. He could not unlearn the habits that had kept him alive. And yet, as the years passed, something softer returned. There were nights when he could walk out into a backyard in quiet and look up at the sky without feeling like he was being watched. There were mornings when the first thing on his mind was not a case or a coded conversation, but something as simple as whether the weather would be good enough for a short drive with the family. The man who had once vanished from his own agency now found himself recognized in a different way. People had read about his work, seen depictions of it, heard his name in stories about undercover courage. Some of them thanked him. Some asked him to sign things. He accepted this with a mix of humility and slight discomfort. The work had never been about fame. It had been about doing a job as well as he physically and mentally could. In private, the markers he valued most were small. A quiet dinner where his family joked about something minor. A phone call from one of his children, now grown, asking about everyday advice. A grandchild laughing in the next room. These were the sounds he had dreamed about while sitting alone in motel rooms. The reward he had promised himself if he ever made it to the other side. He remained aware that there were people out there who would never forgive him. Men who still grumbled his undercover name in prison yards. Older figures who told stories of the time the Bureau had played them for fools through Wet Quiet Jewel Thief. That knowledge never fully let go of him, but it did not rule him. He had spent enough time in the shadows to understand that you could not live there forever. At some point you had to step into whatever light you could find, even if that light was gentle and carefully shaded. In that sense, his later years were not an escape from his past, but an integration of it. He did not pretend the Donnie Brasco chapter had not happened. He acknowledged it, learned from it, and tried to use its lessons to help others. At the same time, he refused to let those years define every part of who he was. He was still the boy from Erie and Paterson, who had watched men in suits at a bar and wondered what their world looked like from the inside. He was still the young teacher who believed in maps and stories. He was still the naval intelligence man who discovered he had a talent for slipping into the background. He was also the husband who sat quietly beside his wife at the end of a long day, sharing the kind of silence that comes only with years of shared experience. The father who listened to his children tell their own stories. The man who now measured success not by how deep he could disappear, but by how fully he could remain present in his own life. At night, when he lay down to sleep in a bed that did not belong to a hotel, he sometimes let his mind drift back across the years. The bars, the cars, the faces. Lefty, with his endless rules and unexpected tenderness. Sonny, with his controlled authority. The nameless bartenders and dealers and hangers-on who had filled the edges of his vision. He acknowledged them, then let them go. They were part of his story, but not the whole story. Then he would turn his attention to the quiet sounds of his house, the creak of settling wood, the distant hum of an appliance, a clock ticking somewhere in another room, ordinary noises, the kind he had once longed for in lonely motel nights. He breathed steadily, feeling the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow, the simple presence of safety. The storms he had walked through were now memories. Their echoes would always be there, but they no longer defined the weather of his days. In that calm, with the shadows behind him and a modest peace ahead, Joseph Pistone could finally do something he had spent years postponing. He could close his eyes, let his thoughts unclench, and truly sleep.